Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapters 26 and 27. Over the next several chapters, we will be discussing the participial mood of the Greek verb. We'll start today by asking what is a participle in English and noting how similarly participles function in Greek. Then we'll talk about the formation of the present active participle and the present middle passive participle. And we'll end by talking about the translation of the present adverbial participle. That's where we're headed today. What is a participle? Speakers of English change a verb, such as run, into a participial form by adding ing. The boy running across the street was almost hit by a car is an example of a participial form. We can define a participle as a verbal adjective. Let me say that again. A verbal adjective, recognizing that it has both verbal and adjectival elements. An example of a verbal use of a participle is the sentence, "While reading, the woman discovered." The phrase, "while reading," see the ing form, answers the questions, under what circumstances did the woman discover? It's an adverbial usage of the participle. But the same participle, reading, can be used adjectivally in a sentence. The student, reading a book, impressed her teacher. In this particular case, the phrase reading a book tells us something about the student and answers the question, which student? It functions adjectivally. In both of the previous examples, a participial phrase was used. That is, the participle along with words it modifies. So, in the sentence, "The student reading a book impressed her teacher," book is the object of the participial action, reading, and so is part of the participial phrase. Participles in English, then, can often be identified by words ending in ing, and they are verbal adjectives. They can function either adverbially, giving the circumstances of the main action, or they can function adjectively, in some way describing a noun. Helpfully, participles function in a very similar way in Greek. They function both adjectivally and adverbially. So, the focus in these next lessons will be on the grammar. How does this work? We're not learning any new forms. Since participles are verbal adjective, Greek participles will have case endings. That's nothing new. We learned that last semester. So it's a nice review. Yes, just as in English, so in Greek, a participle can be adverbial. So it will have tense, present, aorist, or perfect. And it will have voice, active, middle, passive, or passive forms with active meanings, deponent. But since a participle is also adjectival, in Greek it will have a case ending. Nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative, a case ending that also indicates gender, masculine, feminine, or neuter, and a case ending that indicates number, singular or plural. So a participle in Greek has adverbial elements and adjectival elements, along with adverbial function and adjectival function. Participles in Greek are formed using verbs. So participle is built on a verb. One starts with an unaugmented tense stem. Augments are used only with indicative forms. So, for example, aorist forms of the participle remove the augment from the aorist stem. To that unaugmented stem, a participle morpheme is added. It's a tiny little collection of letters that say, "This is a participle," telling us the mood, but there's also a distinction in participle morpheme that helps us identify voice, active, middle, passive. The participle is then finished with a case ending, which gives us case, gender, and number. So, for example, the participle leontes starts with an unaugmented tense stem, le. The participle morpheme, nu tau, tells us it's a participle and that it's active. The case ending, epsilon sigma, tells us the form is nominative masculine plural. And then a connecting vowel is thrown in to make smooth the form. And connecting vowels will sometimes show up on either side of the participle morpheme, as you will see in examples. The other morphemes that we will note as we're working with participles are usa, which actually is a modified form of nu tau, omicron tau, used with the perfect active, and mena or mene, which are used with passive forms. Because a participle is built on a verbal form, it will have a tense. And in the participles, tense is all about aspect or type of action. There's no time in these non-indicative forms. So the present participle stresses continuous action, the aorist just undefined action, and the perfect action that has been completed with present effects in the time of the speaker or writer. When such a participle gets used adverbially or adjectivally, this aspect needs to be stressed. Sometimes that means a continuous form may be translated with the present, am running, or it could be with the imperfect, was running. Both stress continuous action. What one would use would determine on what the main verb is. While running, he crosses the street. Notice continuous with the present. While he was running, he crossed the street. Notice the use of the imperfect with an aorist. That's what I mean about always stressing the aspect, whether a participle is used adverbially or adjectivally. So let's look here in a color-coded way about how tense and voice can be identified in a participle. The present active participle, the present part, is identified by the present stem. The active part is identified by the participle indicator nu tau. That's the one used for an active. Similarly, in the present middle passive, the present is by the present stem, thus the blue. The middle passive is by the participle morpheme, mena or mene, thus the green. In the aorist active participle, it's an unaugmented aorist active stem that's used, and the nu tau says this is a participle and it's active. In the aorist middle participle, again, an unaugmented aorist active stem is used, but the participle morpheme mena mene indicates this form is a participle, but it's middle. The tricky one is the aorist passive participle because, as one would expect, one would use the unaugmented aorist passive stem, but remember how aorist passives always use active materials. Thus, the participle morpheme nu tau is used here. It tells us that the form is participle, but the passive part, in this case only, comes from the stem. The perfect active gets its perfection from the perfect active stem, its participial and active form from the participle morpheme omicron tau. And the perfect middle passive participle gets its perfection from the perfect middle stem and its identification as a participle and its middle or passive form from the morpheme mena mene. As to the adjectival side of a participle, because it's like an adjective, a participle will agree with a noun or a pronoun that it modifies in case, gender, and number. So if we were taking the English sentence, the woman eating the carrot looked up, if we were taking the word eating into Greek, since woman is the subject of the sentence, the case ending for eating would be the nominative feminine singular. In the sentence, she brought a carrot to the boy sitting on the floor, since the word boy in the Greek sentence, indirect object, would be dative masculine singular, the case ending used on the participle for sitting would be dative masculine singular. Participles, being built as they are on verbs, do convey action. The subject of the participial action is the word, the noun or pronoun, which the participle modifies by agreeing with it in case, gender, and number. So the subject of eating in the first sentence, the one who does the eating, is the woman. In the second sentence, the one who does the sitting is the boy, the subject of the participial action. So let's review what we've learned about participles so far. Participle is a verbal adjective, and so it will have adverbial and adjectival elements, both in terms of its form and in terms of its function. In terms of form, a participle will have adverbial or verbal elements, so it'll have tense, mood, and voice. Adjectively, it'll have case, gender, and number. In terms of function, adverbially, it may answer the question. It may define the circumstances under which the main verbal action takes place. Adjectively, it may tell something about a noun. A participle is formed from a tense stem, a morpheme, and a case ending. And in working with participles, it's all about type of action, not time of action. So the 6 elements in parsing a participle are case, number, and gender, tense, mood, and voice. From this generic discussion of participles, let's now switch to how one forms the present active participle. 4 pieces go together to make the present active participle: the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, the active participle morpheme, nu tau, and case endings according to the 3-1-3 pattern. So the nominative singular of Leo would use the present stem, a connecting vowel, nu tau, and a 3-1-3 ending. Now, in the nominative masculine singular, there is no third declension ending, and a tau can't stand at the end of a word, so it drops off, the remaining form being leon, with the omicron lengthening to compensate for the loss. Liusa is the nominative feminine singular present active participle of Leo, and although we'll talk about usa as a participle morpheme, actually behind usa is nu tau. Grammarians think that when the alpha gets added, there's some kind of other letter historically that was added, perhaps a consonantal iota, which caused the tau to change to a sigma, onsa. The nu then drops out, leaving osa, and to make up for the loss of the nu, the form eventually becomes usa. So although one can make the case that behind usa is nu tau, for all practical purposes we'll never see it. Therefore, we just work with usa as a morpheme. Just know the connection. The neuter nominative singular is lion. The genitive singulars are leontos, liouses, leontos. Notice how in the genitive feminine singular, the alpha changes to eta. That's the rule. That always happens in genitive form, or in feminine forms of the first declension, except after epsilon, iota, or rho. Dative singulars are unremarkable in a 3-1-3 pattern. Leonti, liuse, leonti. In the accusative singular, the feminine eta returns to an alpha, and so the forms are leonta, liusan, leon. Nominative plurals are as expected, leontes, liusai, leonta. Genitive plurals, leonton, liuson, leonton. Interestingly, whereas in adjectives the accent doesn't move in the genitive feminine plural, in participles it does. It goes to the end, like in all genitive plural first declension nouns. The dative plurals are liusi, liusais, and liusi. The adding of the sigma iota causes the nu tau to drop out, and the omicron lengthens to omicron upsilon to compensate. That's the explanation. The challenge here is this form looks exactly like the third person plural present active indicative, and so context will determine which form it is. The final forms, accusative plurals, are leontas, liusas, and leonta. A large chart like that is intimidating. But because you already know the 3-1-3 case-ending pattern from 3-1-3 adjectives, all you really need to memorize are the endings, the participial endings, for the nominative and genitive singular. On, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos. If those are clear in your mind, then when you see them or related forms on a verb, you'll be able to parse them. As one would expect with contract verbs, the contract vowel at the end of the stem contracts with the leading vowel of the participial complex, and so poie plus ontos becomes poi untos, or play ra plus ontos becomes play runtos, and agapa plus ontos becomes agapontos. These are standard contractions that you've learned before. Your textbook also provides a chart of the present active participle of ami. This chart is just the participial endings that are added to the present tense stem. So they are rather easy to figure out. However, some forms can be confused with those of the relative pronoun, such as own and hone. The difference is the relative pronoun has a rough breathing mark, and all of these forms have smooth breathing marks in the present active participle of ami. Forming the present middle passive participle. The present middle passive participle is formed by putting together four components: the present tense stem, as previously, and a connecting vowel. What's new in this form is the use of the passive participle morpheme, mena or mene, and then case endings according to the 2-1-2 pattern. Here is the nominative singular: leomenos, leomene, leomenon. And one can clearly see the commonality with adjectives of the first and second declension. The genitive singular, liamenu, liamenes, liamenu. The dative singular, liameno, liamene, liameno. The accusative singular, liamenon, liamenein, liamenon. The nominative plural, liamenoi, liamenai, liamena. The genitive plural, liamenon, in all three genders. Dative plural, liamenois, liamenais, liamenois. And the accusative plural, liamenus, liamenas, liamena. As with the present active participle, so with the present middle passive participle, the first 6 forms are the only ones that one must know by heart in order to easily parse the others. Amenos, amene, amenon, amenu, amenes, amenu. Actually, memorizing just amenos, aon should be sufficient if you remember that the pattern is 2-1-2. Now we turn to translating the present participle. In this lesson, we will focus on adverbial participles only. We'll leave adjectival participles for a future lesson. First, some basics. The present participle uses the present tense stem. So when you see a participle, if it has a present tense stem, it's a present participle. And the present participle describes continuous action. So any translation has to accentuate the continuous nature of the action. In this lesson, we're working only with adverbial participles. Adverbial participles are anarthrous. That means they do not have an article immediately preceding them. Secondly, adverbial participles give us the circumstances under which the main action takes place. They function like an adverb. These participles will agree with a noun equivalent in case, gender, and number, giving the subject of the participial action. If the participle is active in form with a new tau, the word it modifies does the action. If the participle is passive, using the participle morpheme mene or meno, the word modified receives the action. The action is done to the modified word. That is, the participial action. So when translating participles, one asks 3 questions of the participle. First of all, what's its aspect? If the form is present, as all will be in this lesson, the aspect is continuous. The second question, what is the voice? The participle morpheme indicates if the participle is active, middle, or passive. Whether that passive form should be translated actively, i.e. the form is deponent, depends on the dictionary form. As to meaning, the basic meaning comes from the lexical form. So with present adverbial participles, there are 3 common ways of translating. One is to just add ing to the root meaning of the word. He was in his room studying. That's an example of an adverbial participle. More commonly, though, participles of the present form that are adverbial will be translated temporally, providing the time frame within which the main action takes place. She came to understand, that's the main action, while studying. A third potential way of translating a present adverbial participle is causal. Because they are studying. That's the circumstance under which they get good grades. How does one determine which of these to use? Context is a major part. Let's look at some examples. This first example translates a voice from the heavens saying. The participle is adverbial. Notice it does not have an article. Its antecedent is voice. That's the one that does the speaking part of the participial action. We don't know the main verb, but it could be like a voice from the heavens spoke, saying, or something like that. This second example has the main verbal action. They awoke him. They awoke him saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. Again, the participle is anarthrous. It does not have an article in front of it. It's nominative masculine plural, so it agrees with the subject of the main verb, ageiron, and gives the circumstances under which they awoke him, saying. In this third example, we have two adverbial participles. Seeing, they do not see, and hearing, they do not hear. Again, the circumstance for the not seeing and the not hearing are provided by the respective participles, seeing and hearing. In this prepositional phrase, we have an adverbial participle, legomenein, which is passive in form. The action is done on the word with which it agrees, namely the city. Into a city called Nazareth. Obviously, a city that is called Nazareth is always called Nazareth, so implied in called is this kind of ongoing action. Our final example, coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. By looking at elthontes, one can see that it's a participle. It has the new tau, third declension ending, nominative masculine plural subject, obviously agreeing with the subject of Adon, they saw, but there's something different here. Notice the participial ending is added not to a present stem, but to an unaugmented, it's elth, not aelth, aorist stem. And so the question, what difference might the aorist stem make? Probably it means a sequence, namely, after they came into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. A present participle, had it been used, would mean that while they were coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. So as they're going through the door, there's Mary and the child. Whereas in this particular sentence, it's after they've gotten into the house that then they see the child and Mary his mother. That's the nuance or difference when the aorist is used. We'll learn more about that in the next lesson. But the interesting thing is, you could recognize the form elthontes as a participle, even though you haven't learned aorist participles yet. So in this lesson, we've talked about what a participle is, namely a verbal adjective, and that impacts not only how it's formed, but also how it functions. We went through the formation of the present active and the present middle passive participle and identified those 6 forms of each that, committed to memory, will help in parsing all the other forms. And lastly, we tried some crude translation of a present adverbial participle. As you get more experience, this will come more naturally.